So I've been a big fan of Frostpunk for a while now. After all, I basically made an entire video analyzing the nature of moral choices in games just to have an excuse to talk about what I liked about the first game. Link in the description, of course. So naturally, now that the sequel is out and I've had enough time to play through the campaign, the natural question becomes, how does Frostpunk 2 evolve on the ideas from the original? There's been some debate as to whether the city management mechanics themselves are better or worse than the first game in various ways, but in my opinion, when it comes to how they handle the diplomacy and moral choice systems in the game, I think that they handle them in some very interesting ways. So in the first game, there were only a couple primary ways that you could focus on the development for your city. There were a number of policies that you could implement that were more purely focused on the sake of survival, and that's where you get things like supplementing your people's diet with sawdust to make your food last longer, and of course you always have the option of sending the children into the mines. But once you have some semblance of stability when it comes to basic survival needs, then you have to make a choice between whether you focus the development of your city more around faith or order. And once you make this choice, there was no going back. But it was still ultimately up to you how far you went on either side. And depending on your choices, you might go so far that you end up either converting your entire city into a frenetic cult, or you just straight up become a fascist dystopia. And that was all well and good for the time, but I think that Frostpunk 2 manages to build upon these ideas in a much more complex and nuanced way. You see, in the first game, your city only consisted of maybe a few hundred people. In endless mode, you could probably get that up to like 1,000 if you really tried, but that was about it. And as such, your city was fairly unified in their general opinions of you, hence the entire population being represented by the same hope and discontent meters. But now, the starting city in the sequel is already several thousand people strong, and you can easily get way over 50k or higher by the end of the campaign. So as a result, your city is a lot less unified and it gets split up into a number of different factions. So now, any given building or policy that you enact may appeal to some of your people while pissing off others. The way this breaks down is now instead of simply having order and faith as your only options, there's essentially a three-way alignment chart that represents three pairs of opposing ideals. And I really like how these are laid out because, once again, it's not necessarily immediately obvious which ones are meant to be quote-unquote good or evil. It's up to you to decide which way you want to shift your alignment based on your own moral judgments. To go over all the options real quick, the first pair is adaptation versus progress. Essentially, do you focus more on changing your way of life to live with the cold reality of this new world, accepting it as that new reality, or do you double down on trying to use technology to overcome the cold and keep everyone as warm as possible? Then you have equality versus merit. Do you treat everyone equally, exactly the same, no matter what, or do you maybe reward those who contribute more to the survival of your city? And I mean, let's be real, this one's basically communism versus capitalism, but not all of the policies here are necessarily based around economics. Finally, we have tradition versus reason. Do we try to uphold the values of normal society from before the Great Frost, or do we adapt and use this effective reboot of society to come up with more new radical ideas on how we should maybe shape our society? And like I said, I love that these are all described with very positive terms. If they really wanted to, they could easily portray some of these, like adaptation, as foolhardy, or tradition as pointlessly conservative, or things like that, but instead, everything is described in fairly realistic and positive ways. And on top of that, you're never fully locked into only doing one thing or the other. For example, when I did my first run through of the campaign, I thought for sure I was going to lean super hard more on progress and ignore adaptation, because progress focuses more on technological advancement, and I've always been a kind of sci-fi sort of guy. But when I actually played through the story, I found myself adopting a lot of adaptation policies to the point where I actually had closer to a 50-50 split between them, simply because I found a lot of policies on either side to be pretty compelling. So the fact that you are free to mix and match elements from different philosophies is, I think, super interesting, and it helps add a bit more more nuance and adds a lot more shades of gray to pretty much every option. On top of that, quite often after implementing a lot of these more specialized policies, you usually get an event from someone in your city explaining one of the downsides or even merits of your new policy, and then you're often given a chance to tweak things one way or the other. For example, if you choose to create a proper schooling system for your kids, then the people in your city may end up disagreeing on what subjects should be taught, and you are then given the opportunity to adjust the curriculum to focus more on either teaching the kids things like more survival skills so that they can forage for ingredients and survive in the Frostland, or you could focus more on science and philosophy to help improve the technological development of your city. Or you can of course take the middle road and focus on a more balanced education, which of course makes none of your local factions happy. These all come with different modifiers to your existing policies to tweak the benefits and downsides to the laws that you've already implemented. And this sort of thing comes up a lot, and I really like this because it adds just more shades of gray to your choices. And for the record, a similar thing happens if you go for the child apprentices route instead, which is this game's kinder way of phrasing child labor, basically. So ultimately, this choice, which originally seemed like a pretty simple binary, ended up having a lot more variations hidden within it. So, just to zoom out for a minute and go over these systems more generally, Frostpunk 2 does a lot of things to avoid the common pitfalls that I pointed out with many other morality systems in my previous video. Like I said, almost nothing is portrayed as explicitly the quote-unquote evil choice. They use very positive terminology for most of the policies and research in the game, which makes sense because most people don't actively campaign themselves as the evil faction who does bad things. Each decision you make has legitimate and tangible benefits and downsides. They don't make one or the other seem morally or objectively better than the other. Sure, maybe in certain ways they may be better, but it depends on what you value, and so it really feels more up to the player to decide which one they think is just. And furthermore, even when only two choices are presented, there's still often more nuance that helps make the choices more complex than a simple black and white binary. And many policies may start out with way more than just two choices, depending on what factions you have and whatnot. Not to mention that now that your city is divided up into these opposing factions, it muddies the waters even more. Previously in Frostpunk 1, you could maybe interpret that anything that made your citizens as a whole happier was the good option, and things that made them more discontent was the bad one. But now, pretty much everything you do will probably make one group happy and another group upset, so you can't even rely on something like that to judge your actions anymore. And that also leads us to one of the more interesting mechanics that I've seen in a game like this: the Council. So many city builder games, including Frostpunk 1, essentially give the player the ultimate authority to do pretty much whatever they please. So, I mean, it makes sense because you don't want to necessarily take away too much agency from the player, but I think that Frostpunk 2 manages to implement a democratic council really well. Essentially, now that the city is so huge, the people want to say in how things are run around here. So now, every time that you want to implement a new law, instead of just decreeing that it is now so, you have to put it to a vote. And this is where you can really pay for the consequences of your actions. Sure, some laws are easy to pass. If the majority of your city values things like progress or merit or whatever, and those people like you, then if you introduce a law that reinforces those ideals, it'll probably get passed no problem. But then you get laws that might be more controversial. The people might be divided or even actively opposed to a law that you introduce. And so, if you want to get it passed, you have to start shaking hands and making deals. And this creates a really interesting gameplay loop based around diplomacy, where you can keep routinely making promises in order to get the policies that you want passed. And that can help appease one faction or the other who might be opposed to your ideals. But then you need to actually uphold those promises in order to avoid pissing them off. And in doing so, you might have to end up letting that faction, say, put a different law up to vote that you don't want passed. Which means that now, in order to make sure it doesn't get passed, you have to make more promises with more factions to try try and continue swaying things in your favor. I just personally found this level of politicking and having to negotiate with these representatives of each faction to be really compelling, because honestly, I feel like that's the real trouble of running a city like this. If all I had to do was make sure the food supply was stable and everyone was warm, then that would be challenging, but ultimately it'd be kind of trivial. But realistically, people in a city this large are going to inevitably disagree on how we should stock up on food, or the ways that we should try and keep everyone warm. And despite having to negotiate this inevitable clash of ideals, trying to balance out options across all of these different factions while constantly trying to uphold my various promises that I've made, I think that just makes for a really compelling personal journey through the game. Maybe one faction just absolutely goes against almost everything you believe in, but they still probably represent thousands of people in your city. So just ignoring them and trying to implement policies that you still want to go for will just make them more and more upset. You can try to condemn them and try to de-radicalize them to downplay their significance, but in doing so, they might revolt, cause even more trouble, and potentially even kill people. So you might have to suck up to another faction that you're not a fan of, since getting rid of an entire faction is no small task. And even then, because there's like 3 different axes that each faction aligns themselves with, it's rare that you'll get a faction that just completely opposes literally everything that you want to do. For example, when I booted up an endless mode run after beating the main story, I got this faction called the Venturers, who are basically just smug rich assholes who want to grind the poor into the dirt. Needless to say, I wasn't a huge fan of them, but they're also the only faction in my city that believed in progress, which means that if I did manage to get rid of them at some point, then nobody in my city would be left to offer progress-related ideals, which means I can't actually research laws and technology in that direction without them. It's a really interesting way of introducing moral choices systemically without having to necessarily script out every interaction, which I think is usually really hard to pull off, so I think it's extra impressive that it ends up working so well in this game. That said, I think you get the idea by now. I don't think I need to turn this video into an insane hour-long deep dive into every single little system in the game to keep getting my point across. Generally speaking, in my opinion, Frostpunk 2 just really builds upon a lot of the interesting ideas of how the first game handled morality, and even fixes some of the minor complaints that I had at the time, all while still making each decision that you make more complex and nuanced to a point that I think is rare to see in a game like this. And you know, I've actually been having a lot of fun dissecting how the morality systems work across these various games in these videos, like Frostpunk and Mass Effect and Fallout and such, so I think I kind of want to turn this into a series. People clearly liked my last video on the subject, and I got a ton of recommendations for other games that I should check out based on how they handle their own morality systems, both good and bad. Some things that they've mentioned are things like FTL, the Metro series, Infamous, Pathologic 2. Hell, a ton of people mentioned Undertale, and I honestly feel like it's worth making another video just to cover that. So I think that you can look forward to more videos coming soon where I continue to analyze the morality systems of these various games. But for now, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. What did you think of how Frostpunk 2 handled its morality systems? And if you have any recommendations for other games like those that I should analyze as well, whether you think they're good or bad, feel free to let me know down below. Also, I am taking suggestions for what I should maybe call this little series that I'm making, so if you have any ideas, I am notoriously terrible at naming things. But for now, if you liked what you saw, make sure to leave me a like. If you want to see more videos like this, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell if you want to help the channel out. My Ko-Fi is linked in the description, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.